What if one of the most important chapters of biblical history has been hiding in plain sight? A chapter involving kings, prophets, empires, and an entire continent. Because Africa didn't just appear in the Bible. At key moments, it helps shape the story itself. An African kingdom preserved Israel. Africa sheltered Jesus. An African man carried the cross. And one of the earliest recorded Christian converts was African. Yet millions of Christians have never heard these stories. So here's the question. If Africa appears throughout the biblical story, why do so many people think it was absent from it? The answer isn't what most people think. Today, we're uncovering Africa's forgotten role in the Bible. And by the end of this video, you'll see that Africa wasn't standing on the edge of the biblical world. It was standing right in the middle of it. And if you enjoy uncovering forgotten stories that challenge what we've been taught about history, subscribe and join us. Together, we'll explore the people, places, and events that history often overlooks but never should have forgotten. Let's begin with Jesus, because this is where many people experience their first surprise. Most people know the story of his birth, the shepherds, the wise men, the gifts. But what happened next? Danger. King Herod believed a future king had been born, and he wanted that child dead. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph received a warning in a dream. Take the child, take his mother, leave immediately. And where did they go? Egypt. Think about that for a moment. Before the miracles, before the disciples, before the Sermon on the Mount, before the cross, Jesus found safety in Egypt. What might have happened if Egypt had not become a refuge for the Holy Family? Egypt became a place of refuge for the Holy Family during one of the most dangerous moments in their lives. Quick question. Before watching this video, had you ever heard that Jesus found refuge in Egypt? Let me know in the comments. That's a remarkable detail, yet many people rush past it without stopping to think about what it means. If Egypt sheltered Jesus during one of the most dangerous moments of his life, why is that detail almost never part of the conversation? But here's where the story gets even more interesting. This wasn't the first time Africa had protected God's people, not even close. In fact, centuries earlier, another African kingdom had helped preserve the entire family line of Israel. And without that story, much of the Bible would look very different. That kingdom was Egypt. Now stop for a second. When you think of Egypt in the Bible, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For many people, it's Pharaoh, the plagues, the Exodus. But before Egypt became the place Israel escaped from, it was the place Israel survived because of. The story begins with Joseph, sold by his brothers, taken far from home, forced into slavery. Everything seemed lost. But then, something unexpected happened. Joseph rose through the ranks of Egyptian society until he became one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Then, disaster struck. A massive famine spread across the region. Food became scarce. Families faced starvation. Entire populations were in danger. But Egypt was prepared. Because of Joseph's wisdom, grain had been stored during years of abundance. And when famine arrived, people came to Egypt seeking survival, including Joseph's own family. Think about the significance of that. An African kingdom became the place that preserved the family line of Israel. If Egypt had not preserved Jacob's family during the famine, how different would biblical history look today? Without Egypt, the biblical story might have unfolded very differently. But Egypt's role in Scripture was far from over, because generations later, another figure would emerge, a man whose story would become known around the world. Moses. Most people know the story. The baby in the basket, the burning bush, the confrontation with Pharaoh, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea. One of the most famous stories in history unfolds in Egypt, on African soil. Millions know the events. Few stop to think about where they happened. But here's a detail many Bible readers completely miss. Why is this story rarely discussed when people talk about race, identity, and the Bible? Moses himself had a direct connection to another African kingdom. The Bible tells us that Moses married a Cushite woman, a woman connected to the land of Cush.
And when some people criticized Moses because of that marriage, God stepped in immediately. God defended Moses. It's a small detail, but it reveals something important. The biblical world was more connected than many people imagine. People traveled, families crossed regions, cultures mixed, and Africa was part of that story from the very beginning. Now, remember the name Cush because it's about to become important. Quick question, how many African kingdoms mentioned in the Bible can you name? Most people struggle to name even one, yet the Kingdom of Cush appears again and again throughout Scripture. Most scholars connect Cush to regions in modern Sudan and Ethiopia, and this wasn't some forgotten corner of the ancient world. Cush was powerful, influential, and well-known. One of its rulers was a king named Tirhakah. The Bible mentions him during the reign of King Hezekiah. What's fascinating is that historians have also found evidence of Tirhakah outside the Bible. He wasn't a legend, he was a real ruler, a real African king involved in events connected to biblical history. Think about that. The same Bible many people associate mainly with Israel also records interactions with powerful African kingdoms. But the next African ruler connected to the Bible may be even more famous. A queen, a traveler, a seeker of wisdom, and her journey would become legendary. The Queen of Sheba is one of the most recognized women in Scripture, yet people still debate exactly where her kingdom was located. Some historians connect Sheba to southern Arabia. Others point to strong ties with the Horn of Africa, especially regions linked to modern Ethiopia. Where do you think Sheba was located? Arabia, Ethiopia, or perhaps both? Let me know in the comments before we continue. But everyone agrees on one thing. She ruled a wealthy and influential kingdom, and she had heard stories about Solomon, stories that sounded almost impossible to believe. So she decided to investigate for herself. Imagine the journey, a massive caravan, expensive gifts, hundreds of miles of travel, all for one reason, to discover whether Solomon was truly as wise as people claimed. When she arrived, she questioned him extensively, and according to the biblical account, Solomon answered everything she asked. She left amazed. Thousands of years later, people still remember her journey. But while the Queen of Sheba traveled in search of wisdom, another African figure would become known for something entirely different, courage, and chances are you've never heard his name. His name was Ebed-Melech, and his story may be one of the most overlooked in the entire Bible. The prophet Jeremiah had made powerful enemies. His messages were unpopular. Many leaders wanted him silenced. Eventually, they threw him into a pit, not a prison, a pit, deep, dark, filled with mud, and they left him there to die. Most people stayed silent. Most people did nothing. But one man refused, Ebed-Melech. The Bible identifies him as an Ethiopian, a man connected to Cush. When he learned what had happened, he went directly to the king. He spoke up, he demanded action, and because of his courage, Jeremiah was rescued. How many people know the name of the African official who saved one of God's greatest prophets? Very few. Think about that. One of God's greatest prophets survived because an African official chose to do what others would not. Yet many Christians have never heard his story. Be honest, had you ever heard of Ebed-Melech before today? If stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people discover these overlooked chapters of biblical history. But Africa's role in the Bible wasn't limited to prophets and kings. Soon, Africa would appear again during one of the most important moments in the life of Jesus. When Jesus could no longer carry his cross alone, who stepped forward to help him? The answer is probably not who most people expect. Jesus had been arrested, beaten, condemned, and forced to carry his cross. As he walked towards crucifixion, his strength began to fail. The Roman soldiers looked into the crowd. Then they selected a man. His name was Simon, Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene was located in North Africa, in what is now Libya, and Simon carried the cross of Jesus. Stop and think about that. An African man became part of one of the most important moments in Christian history. Why do so many depictions of biblical history leave people like Simon out of the picture? The Gospels record his name. Mark's Gospel even names his sons. Many scholars believe this may indicate that Simon's family became known among early Christians. Again, Africa appears at the center of the story, not at the edges, at the center. So far, what surprised you most? Egypt protecting Jesus, Ebed-Melech saving Jeremiah, or Simon carrying the cross? Let me know below. And at this point, a bigger question begins to emerge. If Africa appears in the story of Joseph, Moses, Jeremiah, and even Jesus himself, why do so many people still think Africa was missing from the Bible? Keep that question in mind, and if you're still watching at this point, type Africa in the Bible in the comments. I'd love to see how many made it this far, because the story isn't over.
But here's where things become even more interesting. After the resurrection of Jesus, Christianity began spreading beyond Israel. And one of the earliest people to embrace the message was also African. What if the spread of Christianity into Africa began much earlier than most people realize? The book of Acts tells the story of an Ethiopian official, a high-ranking servant of the Kandaki, often translated as the Queen of Ethiopia. He had traveled to Jerusalem to worship. As he returned home, he was reading from the prophet Isaiah, but he didn't understand what he was reading. Then God sent Philip. Philip approached him and explained the passage. He shared the message of Jesus. The Ethiopian believed, and then he was baptized. Think about the timeline. Long before Christianity spread across much of Europe, the message had already reached Africa. That's not speculation. It's recorded directly in Scripture. And Africa's connection to Christianity continued to grow. The book of Acts mentions believers from North Africa helping lead the early church. One example was Lucius of Cyrene, again a believer from North Africa. The early church was more diverse than many people realize. From the beginning, people from different nations were helping spread the Christian message. Africa was there from the start. But the story doesn't end with the New Testament, not even close. After the age of the apostles, Africa continued to shape Christian history. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the most important centers of Christian learning in the world. Christian scholars studied there. Important debates took place there. Ancient writings were preserved there. For centuries, African Christians played a major role in shaping Christian thought. Yet this chapter of history is often overlooked. And that's really the pattern we've seen throughout this entire video. Africa appears again, and again, and again. At this point, the evidence is starting to pile up, yet somehow many people never notice. So let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Africa appears in Genesis. Africa appears in the story of Joseph. Africa appears in the life of Moses. Africa appears in the age of the prophets. Africa appears in the life of Jesus. Africa appears in the birth of the church. If Africa appears throughout the biblical story, why do so many people still think it was absent from it? The pattern is impossible to ignore. And if you're enjoying this journey through the forgotten side of biblical history, subscribe now, because this story doesn't end here, and there are many more hidden chapters waiting to be uncovered. Africa was never absent from the biblical story. It was there all along, woven into the narrative from beginning to end. So the next time someone says Africa is missing from the Bible, remember this: Africa helped preserve Israel, Africa sheltered Jesus, Africa appears throughout the prophets, Africa helped carry the cross, Africa was present at the birth of Christianity itself. The question is no longer whether Africa had a place in the biblical story. The question is why so many people were never told. And once you see it, it's impossible to unsee. Before you go, I have one final question. Which African figure in today's video surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you're fascinated by the forgotten connections between Africa, the Bible, and world history, subscribe and turn on notifications, because some of the most important stories in history aren't hidden. They are simply no longer being told. And together, we're bringing them back into the light.